Well, since there's going to be some form of archive of this as well, I may as well start talking. Actually, I might want to check the volume by actually watching the stream too, because I'm not too familiar with how to actually check that yet. All right. Yeah, okay, I can definitely hear that. There's a bit of a delay, which is funny, but, to be expected. Okay, what next then? Probably announce that the stream has started. Just gotta make sure the link I'm going to send people actually works. That would be good. Not working so far. Okay, that's better. Yeah, so this should be working then. Got that posted on Reddit. The other place I'm sending out a notification is Blue Sky. That looks like there might actually be one person watching. You know what? That was probably just me, and it failed to update that I'm no longer having the window open. Yep, there it goes. I have a lot of followers on Blue Sky, at least relative to the subreddit, but that's all from like a starter pack or something I'm a part of, so like none of them are active. May as well see if that link works again. Apparently, I've disabled playback on other websites, which is probably inconvenient, but, whatever. That's probably just a setting I have to enable, which I have not done yet. But I'm gonna wait at least till 8 to actually start going over the rulebook. I don't really expect anyone to show up, but, may as well give them a chance, Looks like there could be one person here. Feel free to say hello if you're actually watching. Yeah, that was probably just me, and it being really slow to catch up to the fact that I'd tested the link and then closed it again. Yeah, it looks like someone has liked the post on Reddit saying that the discussion is now live, but we do not have any viewers here yet, it appears. But, any amount of engagement is good on some level. I'm probably going to talk about the way I actually have this stream set up too, because I think some of it is pretty interesting information, at least how I've got the screen sharing working, because even if you're not going to try streaming, which I'm sure most people that'll show up to this aren't, how you get to view a PDF in Chrome, I've found, has had multiple applications for me that have been useful. Alright, it's officially showing 8 o'clock for me. May as well get started. So the game that we're going to be looking at today is called And Funny Voices. Interestingly enough, I think it's actually by someone who makes videos on YouTube who goes by Una the Puppet. You can see a little drawing of the puppet they use there. Puppet Master Una, that's who it's written by. Illustrations, editing. Now some public domain art, which is always a good idea to use if you can't necessarily pay for all the art you're going to get. Or finding artists who will let you use their art with permission, stuff like that over AI. And copyright 2023. It shouldn't be scracking like that. That's probably messing with a lot of stuff. Sort of standard licensing things, it looks like. I really like to see if there was a fan content policy, which you might technically call this as falling under, but I figure I'm in very little danger. So the table of contents looks fairly good so far, both in terms of readability and the order in which information is introduced being likely, sensible. Starting with an introduction, then some rules and character creation, and a bunch of example of things, because that's largely how this product works. It's not really a lot of rules, but it's still 50 pages of content anyway, so a lot of it is going to be examples and guidance and stuff like that. I'm not going to be reading this out loud for now, may as well save time. I'm sort of speeding through this too, because I've actually already looked at and given feedback on a decent portion of the beginning of the book. Rules that over time fade into the background seems very odd for how, like, that's a phrase I would expect to apply to a game with complicated rules that sort of just become second nature, but this is a game with very few rules that, if you're going to be using it all, you kind of have to keep in mind. So I don't know if that would be an accurate descriptor. How I'm doing this right now is I'm viewing this as a PDF through Chrome and sharing the Chrome tab, because that's all I can really do with the setup I have currently. However, it's really easy to view a PDF through Chrome. You can just sort of right-click the file and then open it with Chrome. And that's a very useful thing to know how to do because, at least in my experience, if you're, say, trying to print a PDF in landscape on Mac, or at least a certain version of Mac, I don't know if they've fixed it by now, the margins are cut off like super wide for some reason. and it's hard to fix that printing the PDF directly, but if you print the PDF as a Chrome page, you can fix that pretty easily. So, just a neat little tip that might be helpful to someone. Have never actually looked at Free Kriegspiel Revolution. It's important to note that these rules may not be everyone's cup of tea. Is it really important to note that, though? Like, I don't think anyone who was reading this would be like, I don't like this kind of set of rules, and then would, upon hearing that the author knows you may not like those set of rules, would continue reading. Like, I don't know what the point of stating this really is, because it doesn't really change anything for the reader. There are a lot of things you can explain in when writing a tabletop game, especially when rules are the way they are. That frankly, like, it's stuff you want to establish because you want to represent yourself in the best way possible, but ultimately does nothing to actually convince the viewer that the rules are good or make it easier for them to learn the rules. It often, in fact, does the opposite. So sometimes explaining yourself is really unnecessary and unhelpful. I'm not sure this is a case of that, but just saying I don't technically know it's important to note that. Might not be a bad thing, though. And this is another kind of weird explanation. Like, you are not selling me on this very well at all. You're not like saying, I think this is the best way to play a game. Like you sort of are with that my friends and I love to play, but you don't really say love to play more than other styles. And the way you're writing this, it makes it sounds like you only wrote this rule book as a devil's advocate, because this kind of rule set doesn't receive a lot of support, rather than because you think you are a good person to write these kind of rules, or your system in particular is super good, or you're super passionate about this style of rules, or anything like that. The way this is written, it just sounds like you're like, no one else is doing this, so I may as well. And that's not a great way to sell yourself. And I'm sort of talking in terms of you, as though the creator of this rule book is watching the video and the only person watching the video, and realistically, that's probably what it's going to be like if anyone's going to watch it. So, yep, setting agnostic and all that. Yeah, and a lot of this stuff I've already gone over, so I think I'll just read off some of my. Yeah, because I don't want to. I've already written feedback on this. I don't expect other people are really going to look at this, so I don't want to read off stuff I've already written. I might just at this point skip ahead. I'm not going to go into exact detail, but I think there's some flaws with the basic rules that I don't think have been addressed at this point. Not all the bases are covered. There's some imbalances and stuff, but I'm just going to summarize here. Yep. DM plans the world while the players make characters. Sure, that's accurate, I suppose. That's not always going to be the case, especially for a more rules light kind of thing. That might be very little prep, but that can be gotten into later. Yeah, more or less. Yeah, more or less. I don't know if that's really a great way to explain it. to someone new who doesn't understand things. It's sort of a very analytical, though simple description of what happens, not really a user-friendly one necessarily. Yeah, this is one of the things I complained about. Um, the players should agree with the PM on the believable actions the world can take. That doesn't does that mean the players should just go with the flow? Does that mean the PM should make something agreeable? Does that mean the game should stop until people come to an agreement? I feel like this statement is not super helpful in its current form. Yeah, that's probably necessary even in something as rules light as this. Yep. And now this is where things get complicated because we've had simple explanations for like every other bullet point, but this one is clearly a lot longer. The PM in consultation with the players assigns a target number. Consultation with the players would honestly be more of a hassle than anything, but that's personal opinion. Now, if we're trying to be kind and stuff and open to anyone reading, it's not the difficulty of the role, it is the difficulty of the task. And the role needing to be higher is reflective of that. The role is not the thing that is difficult, and talking about how the difficulty of the task is related to the number is important for someone who is not really introduced to this concept at all. Okay, so there's a lot of information here that is not necessary, really. Like saying 2 is easy and 20 is hard. Like, when I saw something this big, I expected they were actually going to explain how rolling worked and all that, but they really don't do that. And they have, like, I feel like this could be substituted with, you roll and you want to get over the TN because that's not information you've really provided, and it would make, 2 is easy, 20 is hard redundant, and so you could cut down on that in favor of actually explaining what a roll is, which would be better. And this last part is kind of confusing when the PM has already been decided. You're adding that it should, vary based on things that should go when you're talking about how the PM is decided earlier here. So, I don't like this description. It's very long and detailed without providing really basic information, and it also or information that would actually tell someone how to roll or what difficulty in a roll represents in terms of a challenge. It's just not very well written for beginners. That I'm trying to go back to see what PM is made because I didn't really pay attention to the acronym earlier. Wait, what? Okay, I confused PM and TN there for a solid minute. I think launching into abbreviations this early as well is also just not super user friendly. People aren't too familiar with it at this point, especially when you've got two different sort of similar acronyms. You may as well just fully write out stuff for now. Oh, okay, so now we're getting into how it actually works. A lot of this information is just not necessary. It's interesting that you have exceptional successes in Like, I wouldn't have a specific benchmark for that in a rules light thing. I would just say if you feel like a player's got above the number pretty high, make the success better. But that's, just me. I just don't think if you're going to have a very limited number of hard thing ways the game works, having that to have a specific value for critical success is kind of a waste, I feel like. Yeah, and then this one doesn't have a value for some reason. Yeah, I had some complaints about that writing too that I've stated in the feedback I've provided before. I don't feel like going into it now. Yeah, that could really be explained more. Like, I, as someone who is familiar with RPGs, instantly know what that means. Like, if, say, someone loses an arm, that's an extreme example, but say someone fails before, as a result, one of the options would be losing an arm potentially, and you could choose that specifically knowing that that choice would later make things more difficult for that player. And consequences are resolved according to the story's progression. That is extremely unhelpful. I don't even know what that means. Okay, like this, it's a fairly common way of dealing with, death and rules letter system. There's just a way for consequences to sometimes be physical, and when you've gotten a certain number of physicals, you die. I've seen that a decent number of times. I've always hated it. It is super wishy-washy to me, and if you are going to have actual rules around when a character dies, that's one of those things I think you just either base on the story or have something really hard and, definitive on what may or may not cause a character death. If you're gonna have something like this, like when do physical consequences happen? What kind of physical consequences? Why would, say, losing a finger result in death? Blah, blah, blah. Just, I really hate this kind of system. I just don't think it makes any sense to have rules around death, but then have those rules be, you know, still up to the DM effectively anyway, and kind of arbitrary. Like, this just feels extremely arbitrary. And like I said, I've seen it before. I've never liked it once. But like in times you see it before, at least you definitively know what causes a physical consequence versus another kind of consequence a lot of the time. And I get the sense that that's not even going to be present in the system. Okay, this is another thing that just is totally incomprehensible to me. Like, I could probably figure out what the creator might mean if I thought about it, but why would I have to work for that in something that is supposed to be easy to understand? And on to character creation. I don't think I really got that far before, so I might actually be onto some new stuff here. Okay, so once the PM introduces the world, players will create a fitting character. That is too reductive to say that it has to go that way. I find creating a world for the characters works a bit better. Usually, the world and the characters will be an active, conversation that comes together with everyone. It's just like, this is never a way I really feel like I have seen character creation actually happen. And for something that, is supposed to be kind of loose, it's weird that that aspect is that rigid. Like, you do need to establish that the DM has, some input on character creation to make sure nothing wild happens, but this isn't to me the way to do it. And it's already been established earlier too. Right, identity in one descriptive sentence. That is a way to do things, I guess. Okay, having one definitive flaw ain't a bad idea. A basic concept of the character. I would not do it with, I would say at least 1 to 3 sentences for concept, but that's just me personally. Okay, and then traits. Okay, so these are basically what turn into skills. We need to definitely hear more about that before we figure out if it's a workable way to do things or not. All right, items. I feel like having a focus on items and something rules light is always a pain, but that's just me. I've never liked items, so that might be entirely personal. Okay. Like encumbrance. I do have a lot of trouble getting a handle on this. Maybe I've just uh, been thinking about things wrong because I think when I read about this or the person that made it talked about it before, I was under the impression that sort of this first page was all the rules you needed. Technically, I thought I heard that from him somewhere in some way. But if there, as it turns out, are a lot more rules, then you know it's fine that to have stuff like over encumbrance and stuff. But if this, set of a couple pages are supposed to be the main rules, having encumbrance be one of the important things that you need to have rules for just seems excessive to me. Like, obviously, you want a way that a player can't, just have infinite amounts of stuff, but having something that is in any way crunchy for that in this kind of system seems unnecessary. I'd just say put a hard limit on it, or say the DM can step in to what's reasonable for a person can carry, and that would be a much better way to do it, in my opinion. But that all depends on how much rules there end up actually being in the system, because I might have been wrong about how rules light it is. It's been a long time since I looked at sort of the basic overview of the system. Okay, that's nice advice, I guess. I don't know why a name would necessarily be last, but whatever. It doesn't really matter. When creating characters as a group, keep 2 important things in mind. Are you saying that that's always what happens, that it's always as a group, or that if you are creating characters as a group? Because when makes it sound like if, but I don't think it's really supposed to be if. Yeah, sure. That's nice. Yep, sure. I really need to know more about this stuff, though, because that's super important. Okay, nice art. Okay, and we're on to examples. I would not be on to examples before this is explained, because I have no idea what this means really, and that is incredibly important. Okay, concept. I don't know why that bugs me. Like, in a basic concept, to have an organization that isn't explained is annoying. This is why something like 1 to 3 sentences is better than just one. Like, what's the point of this tells me nothing, you know? That's probably good advice. It's a fun way to say that. Okay. For Rook, you'll find more powerful traits but less powerful items. How is that balanced? And like, is it on every player to constantly balance their character? Like, why would you choose to do it this way? That is not a helpful descriptor to me. Like, what I would really want for this is what the heck this specific trait does and what it means for the game as a whole. This is another where I would not agree with on description. It would be better to say that, two sort of things can be part of one trait rather than saying fitting true traits on one line works when each thing is supposed to be specifically one trait. You should not call one trait two traits. That is really messing with, the way you are defining terms. In agreement with the PM, vague traits can be very useful. I feel like that's asking too much of people to so much seems like it has to go into figuring out your character, not for what you want your character to be, but for mechanics. Even though mechanics are extremely loose, you have to make sure your traits are specific or vague, and those each have differing effects on mechanics, and then you have to decide whether they're going to be good or the items are going to be good. It's just a lot. It's like I would not want people as a DM to be trying to make things vague to, figure out whether or not they can do stuff. Like if it's all just going to be a trait and then the player is going to argue about how it affects what their character is able to do, I'd prefer them to just give a description of a character and then suggest their character could do something. And I agree or not. I wouldn't want to have to force them to have three specific things for that. Especially because you can do stuff like this that, is incredibly vague and could apply anywhere, and then you're just arguing about whether it applies or not anyway. You may as well just have a full description of a character instead of forcing it to be in three abilities that are technically two abilities, I guess, if you're reading that. Okay, daggers, a lot of daggers. No brackets for this, even though that was suggested, though. Because it would be less fun, I guess, but you can say that for almost anything, like even actual money, if it's like coppers or something. Assuming it's not full gold coins, then just always having extra copper coins that come out of nowhere is fun too. Like you can really say that about anything. Okay, I think that's kind of strange to me. Like, I don't know why you would force I don't know why you would go with a name at this point. You can either just put the character in your background, or you can say by a great thief and then come up with more later. Like, I guess having the name has value, but then I don't even know where you would add things that are going to be fleshed out. Like, it hasn't said that you add to a backstory. There's not really even a backstory segment for a character sheet other than a single line. So I don't know how it would be fleshed out later. And, you could do it through gameplay, but I would want to be able to write it down at least. Like, a lot of this is probably just going to be me complaining about things that are the way this kind of system generally works. But, like, if something's gonna be rules light, I prefer it to be extremely open And this is really not that open to me. It's like, you have to have a specific number of traits, there's encumbrance rules, there's a hard number of items you can have. And then there's sort of stuff like this where it feels like it's almost like, I don't know, a Mad Lib style prompt where you're coming up with random things just to make up stuff about them later, which, is a way you can do things, but it's not like that didn't seem like it was supposed to be the point of the system. I don't know. I guess I do have an understanding of how the traits work sort of now. Like, I can definitively say that these are supposed to be treated like a single ability, but some of them can be applied all over the place. So I would have liked a description of, each trait is an ability earlier, because the description we have is these are what enable your character to accomplish extraordinary feats and can include a variety of things. I guess like something to more clear say that each trait is supposed to be an individual one of these things, which I think is what they're going for, would be helpful. Okay, and this specifies it makes it more clear that the stuff you're randomly throwing in here are supposed to be things that the PM is really the one that figures out, even though they say stuff earlier like, you know, find out in game together with agreement from the PM. Like, so it's just, are you the one who's deciding what these things do, or is the PM the one deciding where, it looks like the PM is writing your backstory for you? Like, it's not just in world, it's in world as part of your backstory. Short legs and temper. In general, the greater the flaw, the greater the traits you can use to balance it out. I kind of just have to say no on that. There's no system in place that causes that. You can say in general, the GM should make it so that is the case, but acting like this is the way the system works when there's nothing to really establish that to really, tell people to make the system works that way. Like, this isn't a command. This is an observation, as though this is just naturally how this would work as set out, but that's not the way I see it. And all of this stuff should be like, if that's going to be important and stuff you want people to follow as advice, it shouldn't just be hidden in examples. Okay, fair. I was thinking it's sort of against type because it's on a dwarf, and learned dwarfs are not often emphasized. However, who's going to know that's against type? That only works if the people you're playing with are all familiar with, these kinds of archetypes. A grip as strong as a giant's. If you want something very powerful, put a limiter or qualifier on it. So I guess this is very powerful. And right now, I do not see the limiter qualifier. What does that mean? This whole thing is confusing there. Okay, near hypnotic dwarven throat singing. Cool, honestly. Yeah, that's more or less fine for this, I suppose. Okay, an axe. And apparently he has weaker traits, and yet it is on this character that we, specifically say that a trait he has is very powerful. At least that's what I think that text implies. And we go back to the rogue. We've got, yeah, it's vague, but could be useful, but doesn't really say it's powerful. Similar, just talking about how they're similar. Okay, I guess this implies that this is a very powerful trait. But, since it says trait specifically, I don't know if this one is supposed to be identified as very powerful versus grip as strong as a giant, which both based on the description and just to me seems like it would be a very powerful trait. Like all of these do not seem like weaker traits than the rogue to me. Okay, full mail. A lot of gold. Okay, how much gold? But it doesn't say how much gold. Like, why? I'm actually kind of frustrated by this. Why are you like this? Makes it looks like this is not actually an example of a character, but an example of like a character proposal that is going to be changed later, because you'd think how much would be decided at character creation, but it's not written here in any way. Like, that's a weird format to write this in. Yeah, almost as important here. Limited amounts can be crucial. Since it is a single flask, like it doesn't say multiple flask, that definitely seems very limited as opposed to the dwarven gold, which, to be fair, is one bag, but with no real projection of how the size of that bag is versus a flask, which I can make assumptions about size a lot easier. Okay. I guess. Are you going to put parentheses dwarfs exploration pack? If not, you may as well say exploration packs may vary between characters, because that would also make sense. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a bit and see the examples of the character sheet to see if stuff like the fat bag of golden dwarves is of dwarven gold, not golden dwarfs. That would be a funny thing to have a bag of, though. Is actually established in the usable versions of the sheets. Oh god, it's sideways. And still, well, brackets. So they're supposed to have the potential for numbers to go in there, but then it's like, okay, is it one bag of gold, or how much gold is in the bag? And you'd think it would be filled in. So I guess the sidebar about figure out the amount of gold is a message to someone using the example character sheet that they, with their PM, should decide, because the creator doesn't want to specify, what the amount of gold is. He wants the PM of that particular game to do it, to be able to have input on that. But that just sort of seems like a major flaw in the way this is being done to me. Like, why provide examples if they're not fully playable examples? And to me, the amount of gold is very different than stuff like the blue spider venom. It's like, because that's venom. It poisons something. That's what it does. It's not hard to say, but a gold, what gold actually does varies so vastly depending on its amount. That's something that there needs to be some kind of established thing for. And this just doesn't provide me much input as a player onto how to incorporate that into a character sheet, the argument and then the decision and stuff like that. Okay, in a game example, problem solving. Normally, for this kind of thing, I would think there would be a description of problem solving before there is examples of it. That's just usually how things are done. Okay, advice topics. Not sure what that means. Okay. I still don't know what advice topics means. Okay, so this seems like a mismatch to me. So this is talking about sort of like you will need to give a lot of descriptions of the environment to help the characters come up with ideas and figure things out and stuff, but ultimately, in the in-game example, the PM does not provide the senses and then let the players run with that. He provides the senses and then specifically tells them what they mean, i.e., that there are three goblins. So I would think this would be better to just be there's the smell of roasting rats and the sound of cackling, and leave out that part, or just you see three figures camped at the exit, or you see a fire or something that can help the players figure out there's people outside in front, but does not give them all the information right away. And you can argue they're just providing the sense of vision by saying three goblins, but even just going three crouched, small, pointy-eared green figures without specifically saying they're goblins, I feel like is a lot better way of doing things because that gives the players the chance. It focuses on the senses and gives the players the chance to make inferences or ask questions based on those senses, a la this, i.e., are those goblins? Yeah, and immediately going with how do you proceed seems to cut out the whole phase of players reacting to their senses and talking to each other, or just sharing their characters' thoughts and stuff, going immediately into action. Okay, go around and attack. And it's important to note that in this example of play, one of the characters is just acting immediately without consulting the group on what they might want to do or whether anyone might want to talk or anything like that. And I feel like that doesn't set a good example. Alright, this is another thing I think is not stated great because they are already establishing that this is definitively a role, right? Now, obviously, you're going to want the PM to change this into a role at some point, but at the start, it's not a role. It's just the player saying what they want their character to do. And then, as the PM, it would be your job to figure out whether that's going to be a role, whether that's going to be multiple roles, how the time frame goes on that. This sort of just automatically inserts it into, okay, this is a role. And it doesn't even really do that. It's not saying that you take that action and turn it into a role. It's saying that the player is necessarily trying to roll for something, which is not how that works. Like, even just to express this exact thought, I'd probably have it something be more like it's okay to have the multiple things a player tries to accomplish be represented by one role. And I'd probably make the language a bit less complicated too than what I just said, but essentially it's putting the emphasis on the player trying multiple things and then it being okay for you to make that a role, not putting the emphasis on the player doing a lot of things in a role being okay. Because in the player's mind, it's not necessarily about whether it's a role or not at this stage, and that's something as the person running things you have to make the decision on as the PM. The PM's notes say the TN for this scene would normally be a 10. I don't know what that means. Like, why would his notes say, oh, okay, so like you're saying, the PM in their prep specifically decided what a TN for sneaking around the goblins would be? beforehand. I've never done anything like that as a GM, even when I'm preparing a lot of stuff. I don't decide, you know, target numbers before the players even get to that point. I feel like a lot of people don't do it that way. Okay, making it easier. Okay, yeah, so it is advising that you just pre-plan target numbers for the approaches you assume your players are going to take. That just seems like a really bad way to prep things, but like I'm not trying to be like, "Oh my god, if you prep things that way, you're awful." I'm saying like it's weird that I'm sure that's a fine way to prep things. It's just why is that put forward as the way to prep things? Like genuinely, most people don't do it that way, I'm fairly certain. Okay, rolls a 10, succeeds. Like, I mean, this immediately describes why it's weird to have specific target numbers for potential situations that might come up. Like, there are so many things that would make that vary. Okay, so, as I said, there was no discussion. Wait, what? Give me a second. Okay, you slip into the cave entrance. Did the player ever say they wanted to do anything like that? Yeah, they just said what I would assume is if a player was going for a spot in the darkness to attack someone from, I wouldn't think they were going into that person's lair. Like that is just not the idea I get from that statement of intent at all. And it's sort of, it's a very different system that I'm used to where it plays out like a choose your own adventure where, the character selects a path or an approach and then the DM goes into a whole narration of what that character does if they succeed. Like that is a very different way of doing things. For most systems, I don't know if it's more common in Kriegspiel or something, but deciding where exactly the player goes. Normally, you'd be like, okay, you managed to sneak around without them hearing. Where do you go? And obviously, that leaves room for the player to mess things up. Like, all right, I walk right into the goblin center of the camp, even though they just said they wanted to sneak, and that obviously interferes with that, and that can upset turn order if you were planning on having the dwarf go next to something. But in the end, it's still better in my mind to leave that player agency, especially when looking at this. That it does not sound like to me if I heard a player saying they were doing that, I would not expect them to be trying to walk just entirely past the goblins and get into the cave they're guarding. And again, I'm not trying to say like this style of narration is a necessarily bad way to do things. I'm just saying it's weird that it is assumed this is the default when there is nothing about how things work or how the game has been described so far that would give me that assumption. Like that's why having something that sort of describes what problem solving is like as in general is good before the example. I feel like I'm having to figure out what the system wants itself to be by looking at context clues instead of just hearing it described to me. And I'm still not even sure. I'm not sure if this is really what like the writer wants or just sort of an example he threw out. Be sure to share the spotlight at the table. Okay, but like this seems like the opposite of that. Like the GM is narrating everything that happens and just allowing minimal choices from the players. Okay, so now we're getting into how there are supposed to sort of be turns. Well, the player isn't getting to describe what they're doing here. The PM is. And this is, like, another thing I'm sort of about. Like, I would not think it would be a good idea to suggest players to do something else when they have so many limited when their choices are so limited in the first place. Like, at that point, when you're suggesting what action they take and describing exactly how it plays out when they succeed or fail, what are they even doing? Okay, this is an example of PM and players being in agreement on Barger the character. I don't really see how. Like, the player didn't object. Oh, well, I see what you're saying. Okay, okay. I don't think my character is very stealthy. Okay. Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay, that is an agreement. Yeah, like, this isn't entirely bad advice, but you need to be careful on describing what characters do. Like, this is a potentially embarrassing thing to happen to a character, and if, they have a certain view of their character, that's really not gonna make them happy. And, it says here that the goblins went, but I don't really know that they did. They just sort of walked a little. Like, he's nearby them, and they were alerted to his presence. They should be able to do a bit more than start to approach if they really get a, so to speak, turn. Okay, so it's like now they're getting a turn almost after Rook, but I suppose this is describing what already happened in theory. Okay, sort of a death style system. It's also established that you can gain consequences from other parties' successful rolls rather than your own failed rolls, or at least enemies can. It may end up being different for players. Okay, success at cost has not really been established at all up to this point, except, yeah, it hasn't really been established at all, so I don't know why it's being brought up only here. Also, it's not really much of a consequence because he has infinite daggers. Yeah, okay, the players make rolls to avoid the attacks. I wonder if all the rolls are player facing. If the enemies were making attack rolls and that was what determined players were getting hit by things that would be inconsistent with the rules only describing consequences as being a result of failed player rules, but it looks like that's not happening, so that is consistent, which is good. Okay, 15. Which is interesting because, he's in a bad position, right? But he's also got really good armor, and it looks like that has not been factored into anything here. Okay, so 2 attacks, does that mean 2 consequences or only 1 consequence? Yeah, okay, 2 opponents attacking him at once, so the number of opponents is supposed to factor in the TN, not in the extremity of the consequence for the single roll for both of them. Okay, and you're really going to need to establish here whether deafened is a physical consequence. Also, if physical consequence is ever healed, like it seems like they're going to be a fairly common thing if this is a physical consequence, but it just said once you take 3, you're dead, not there's any way of recovering from physical consequences. Okay, there could be 2 consequences, but only because of the gap in the TN roll and not explicitly because of the number of enemies. Yeah, I think it might not be bad to have. This presents the idea of an interesting system where armor as items just gets used up in lieu of taking a physical consequence rather than having to factor armor into every potential attack, like was not done here. And that seems like it would be super annoying to, without having a number prescribed to armor, decide whether armor each time an attack occurs, whether and how much it affects the TN value for that without establishing a specific number for it. If you're not going to have it have a number, it might be a good idea to have it sort of just be an item that takes a hit instead of a consequence, which is sort of similar to what happens here. But he gets a consequence anyway, so it's kind of complicated. Yeah, and it is not established if this consequence is a physical consequence. And that is something you really need to establish. Like, even if only an example, because that is what may or may not lead to death. That's why I kind of don't like, death rules being wishy washy if they're going to be there. Okay, now we're in combat, apparently. Yeah, okay, and this turn order thing is not really being followed, by the way, because we've got. Let me see, and maybe I'm wrong about that. I said that pretty confidently, but I might end up being wrong. But let's see. Bagger rolls. Yeah, so Bagger went. Now the goblins go. Now Rook goes. That's the established turn order. We have the goblins going, which, like I said, isn't really them going, but it says it's them going, and that's basically them walking slightly. Then Rook goes. Yeah, and then the goblins go. So the turn order has been ignored. Alright, but Bagger is attacking. I don't know if he's gotten up or not yet. It's not. Okay, no, it is good. They established that he is still on the ground. He gets a 15. There should be one goblin left. Okay, he runs, but it's very important to establish whether he's running further into the cave or, just away in general. You can't just say he runs, you need a direction. And in theory, that's something a player could ask, but that kind of wastes time during combat. Okay, 17. People will have differing opinions on whether or not you should let players, specifically advise players of how difficult something is, and then allow them to change their choice based on that. So that's something I could also complain about, being offered as a way things should be done generally instead of being more one way of doing things. But I think that option specifically fits this kind of system a bit more, where there isn't a lot of player choice really, except just, or at least not a lot of benchmarks players can use to know what their characters can do inherently, where it is good to advise them of their chances a lot of the time. So I think that being a thing that is established as something you should usually do is a good idea. Yeah, that's an interesting way of doing things. Like, there is the question of whether this is partial success or actually a consequence of failure, depending on how you look at things. Okay, cool. It's a little late for that. You'd think they would have had opportunities to roleplay with each other earlier if that was going to be part of the flow of the game, especially, when deciding what they were actually going to do with the goblins. And this is one of the reasons why having things only shown through examples is kind of a pain. Like, it's not established till now, till the flow of the way the game works seems vastly different than this. It is established that casual roleplay between players with each other actually does occur. Which is kind of funny, here. You specifically go to point out how this is great, and then don't reward the player at all for doing that great thing, and just talk about how there would be consequence to try and actually, you know, react to that, especially since they have infinite daggers anyway. So, character consequences can be added to sheets. I'll have to look and see if that is where that has been established, if it has been at all. Let me just look at the end and see if there's slots for character consequences. That might be the easiest thing to do. Okay, yeah, but it looks like it's only physical consequences since there's 3 of them and there are heart marks next to it. That's okay. No, there are other consequences here, but they also have heart marks, which would imply no, because that's a generic empty sheet. It's not an extra page of that sheet. Yeah, so it's kind of wishy-washy now about whether something is a physical consequence or is not, and what the effects of that are, if there's only 3 slots. And it's not described as a physical consequence in that passage earlier, and yet is described as being added to the sheet in the slot where I would assume it would be for physical consequences based on the number 3 of them and the hearts. What was I? Definitely not on magic. I'm probably gonna be skipping ahead pretty soon. Like, it feels like if we're getting, like, examples for magic and items seem like they're supposed to be critical, and yet I've had to read, like, insofar as 16 pages to get to them, and yet there's not a lot of rules surrounding them. The amount I have to read for a rules light system to get an idea on how the game is actually supposed to work is not ideal. Okay, fair, but a thing that you might want to establish earlier. I would have expected there would be different TNs for healing and getting them to talk, but it seems like it has been rolled into one here. Like, if it was for both thing, that should have been a lot higher than 15, I think. I guess that was just, a method of moving the story along a bit. I feel like the scene has not gone on that long yet, though. Another thing about, like, categorization, unless these are repeated, like, you only get these tips in this segment, which means to get, like, all the valuable tips, like, because I don't know where I'm going to find tips. Say I really wanted tips on, you know, these specific things, I would have had to read the whole book to get them because there's no segment for inventory or item prep specifically. But that's just an assumption. I don't know if this information is repeated later in specific categorized segments or not. Yeah, I'm just gonna skip ahead to see the item stuff. This is an incredibly extreme consequence style thing here. Like, I get the flaw is greedy, but just immediately going, okay, you're gonna kill this guy if you fail is a incredibly bold choice. And that's taking away player agency to a pretty big degree, you know? Like, in fairness, I don't know really how you can do this style of flaw without taking away agency to some extent, but it feels like this is a game with players have very little agency overall. Yeah, and you're even telling them what their character's thought process is. That's like a huge no for me. Well, there we go. It's addressed here. This, again, I'm gonna say no. Maybe that is, true for your specific players. I don't know what happened there. Maybe that is true for your specific players. In general, people are still not gonna like that if you tell them what their characters are thinking. They're just not going to complain if they agree. So they're still gonna be upset, they're just not gonna say anything about it, and that's probably not the case with your players, but I'd say that's a more likely option in general. Yeah, I think I might be getting too tired to, actually pay attention to how things are happening here. Yeah, I'm gonna try to skim magic, but I might not be able to really focus on this. I know we technically started on problem solving, but still, this being part of the example, even though the reader has no context for it, is probably a bad idea because you could interpret this, since there's so much of it in the system, as more just sort of throwing in names without knowing what they're about to figure them out later. But I think this is supposed to be specifically pre-prepared backstory stuff that the players would know about. We just picked up in the middle, but that is not really made clear with the format that this is in. Okay, so items do have descriptions just sometimes, but none of the items that a character makes as part of character creation will be like this kind of item, or it would have been mentioned in character creation. That's a little weird. Okay, I'm just gonna move on ahead. I still don't really know how magic works, but I'm a little tired to really be focusing on this right now. Like, there might have been more stuff about consequences and such, but okay. So after a lot of examples of stuff, we're finally getting into what exactly consequences are. I don't really like the timing of that. Okay, I feel like we've already got a lot on adjustment and fine-tuning. This is a lot of information. Oh, because now we're getting on to I was expecting to just skip ahead to the challenge segment, and that's what I'd figure out about sorry, the consequence segment, and that's where I'd figure about consequences, but players should agree on the degree of character death or removal from the story. We're already getting to this, and this is not we're not in consequences yet. Why are we talking about this now? Okay, so you adjust a target number. Like, this is not something I've ever seen anyone do, and I do not know why you would do it. Or make it, like, a part of a system rather than just a it's almost like he expects you to write a full module for every session. It feels like it's getting to the point of that. Like it's module style design to have preset target numbers that can then be adjusted. But this is just for stuff you're prepping for your players. Like I'd say that's a pretty rare style. Yeah, because like I think this play a role in these expectations is why consequences are being talked about here, but I don't know what expectations he is referencing. Like there's a lot this is making the process of just deciding what a, you know, target number is very complicated, but that is kind of fair for this system because there are so many factors that have no established modifiers but have to modify a situation. Like, going back to the example, two goblins, the weapon those goblins have, the weird position the dwarf was in, the armor the dwarf had, the armor's the dwarf's skill as a warrior was mentioned a couple times. Like there are so many different factors that have no established values as to how they would modify the difficulty of a thing that I understand why they're taking so much time to sort of harp on picking a TN, and when in other systems it would just be like, oh, you think something should be difficult? Okay, you think the character should be good at it? Okay, change the TN based on that. Like that's how it would go in most systems. I get why there has to be a lot more guidance on it for this system, and that is smart in a rule book sense, but I don't know if it's smart in a system sense to have the system be designed in a way where you have to think about so many factors every time you try and establish a TN, especially when some items do, in fact, have descriptions of specific mechanics around them. It's just more rare, because, like, the magic item did. I think this is a cool breakdown, these two segments. Okay, types of consequences. Okay, that's interesting to establish. Okay, and these are consequences you pretty much, it feels like you would have to track, but there's very limited space to track consequences. Okay, like, if you're gonna have stuff like this, you shouldn't even have the thing about 3 physical consequences kills a character at the beginning, if it can happen in one. Because that does not seem like it is a vital part of the system, and yet it is written as though it is a very hard rule. Well, comparatively to the rest of the stuff. And there's been no mention of physical consequences, even though that is used earlier on. I think that rule just should not be there because it has not been referenced at all since then. Okay. Yeah, like a lot of this stuff could potentially have been earlier. Okay, now we're talking about the rule of 3, but it's no longer physical consequences, it is just consequences, which honestly is better. Like, having a distinction between physical and non-physical consequences gets annoying, especially when it's kind of arbitrary whether it's one or the other and not due to severity of failure. So I think, it just being straight consequences that are worthy of being tracked enough to write down rather than just, a specific category of consequences that is not inherently worse, like physical. I think this is better. Yeah, and just removed from the story rather than dead, potentially for a single session instead of the full campaign, even though that's not written down. I think that's a fair way to do things that maybe should be added. And maybe he did, I just didn't read it. I'm kind of skimming now. But this, I think, makes way more sense than what was written earlier. The term physical should totally not have been in there. Okay, it's weird that we're getting at this now. Like, we're so far past character creation. Okay, again, really conflating terms here. If there are 3 traits, you should not call the character sheet a collection of traits. Like, I sort of get what you're saying, because these can all serve the function of traits depending on the circumstances, but then there's kind of no reason to distinguish traits as specifically being traits. It's just, I'd really hate conflating terms when you don't need to. Like, a trait should be a trait. Like, even just calling the 3 core traits from the beginning would be a huge change to this. And that sort of implies stuff like the concept can be taken away, which is, as far as I know, not accurate. Yeah, I can't believe we're only getting into the specifics of how things work into page 25, honestly. I think I'm about to stop reading soon. I've been doing this for about 2 hours. Like, I think this system is a lot more workable than it appeared at first, but you really need a lot of this stuff to be earlier. Like, it is very frustrating reading the generalized version of the rules. I wanted to look at the introduction again. Yeah, so out of here, they say that you can use this by itself. Um, that's sort of implied by basic rules, but I feel like that was written somewhere else in some of the promotion or something. But basically, I don't think this stuff is really at all reflective of what the system actually is. Like either how he expects scenarios to play out or how stuff like traits and consequences actually work. It's kind of like it's to the point of being two different games, honestly. And that's not generally good. Like, I understand having a simplified version of a system and then a more complex one, but to me, it really genuinely feels like two different games. Yeah, I'm just gonna start skipping ahead a bit. Like, the only reason I think of having the way character creation is written before is to have the ability to create a character, like, even the example characters, even going by what you learn from those, to create a character without, really getting too complicated or thinking too hard about it is why I think that's earlier than the more, detailed character creation rules. And yet they reference stuff that's going to be into the more detailed character creation rules with no real demonstration of how to do them or context, like a lot of stuff surrounding balance that I think is frustrating to have. Like this stuff still effectively be in the system, just only referenced rather than referred to. I'm gonna see if he talks about stuff here, you know. Have he talked about how you figure out uh, what the rewards are for an encounter? Because, like I said, those tips should be in this kind of segment, like, and not necessarily instead of the example, but at the very least as well. Yeah, that doesn't really explain it. And we're off of loot already, so it isn't repeated, unfortunately. Yeah, I haven't really been looking at any of these. I'm just seeing if, like, there's something that surprises me just from headings. Okay. Like, I would not start off with why. I would start off with introducing that we're getting into a segment, that describes an adventure. I'm gonna really quickly try to read through some of this, but my laptop is almost out of power, so I gotta stop. Yeah, it's probably gonna die. All right, I'll just end it here. But I ended up liking the system a bit more than I thought I would, but I really think it is not written in a way that it is conducive to liking it. I think it sort of like tries to hide what it actually is in favor of a much more open uh, framework that it's really not. It's expected to be played in certain very specific ways, and some of the guidance and systems around that are interesting, but they don't really work that well with the initial description.